Vietnam, we're fighting a counterinsurgency. It's a whole different type of warfare. She was leading this company of Viet Cong guerrillas.
They were called killer teams.
In the dense jungles of Vietnam, a young American soldier vanished without a trace during the height of the war. His unit searched for weeks, but he was gone, swallowed by the green abyss. What no one knew was that he hadn't been killed. He'd been captured by a hidden group of Vietnamese guerrilla women. For 13 long years, they kept him deep in the jungle, far from civilization, using him for their own mysterious reasons. When he finally reappeared, his story stunned the world, and what he revealed about his captors would change how people saw the war forever. Join us in this video as we reveal the details. A young soldier captured by compassion. In the chaotic year of 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese War tore across the border like a storm. For young soldier Hoang Gan Dong, it was a time when fate could shift in the blink of an eye. With fierce loyalty to his motherland, he marched into the battlefield without hesitation, unaware that one mission would change his life forever. During a violent raid, explosions and gunfire filled the air. Amid the chaos, Hoang was captured, not by a brutal enemy, but by two Vietnamese female guerrillas, Le Chi Ping and Nguyen Thi An. Expecting interrogation or death, he braced for the worst. Yet what came next was nothing short of unimaginable. Instead of hatred, the two women offered him life. They led him deep into the mountains, far from the war-torn villages. There, surrounded by dense forests and misty hills, Hoang found an unexpected peace. At first, confusion and suspicion haunted him. How could his captors show such kindness? But as the days passed, something began to change. They hunted together, shared meals by the fire, and talked beneath starlit skies. Slowly, fear gave way to trust. The three formed an unlikely bond that transcended the boundaries of nation and war. For the first time in a long while, Hoang felt warmth instead of duty, companionship instead of orders. In their laughter and shared struggles, he rediscovered what it meant to be human. Le Chi Ping's calm understanding and Nguyen Thi An's fierce resilience softened the bitterness that war had carved into his heart. Around the campfire, their late-night talks often drifted from survival to dreams, hopes, and memories of home. In those quiet moments, their souls connected in ways no battle could ever destroy. But as the years passed in their hidden refuge, a deep ache began to stir within Hoang. No matter how gentle the mountain winds felt, or how close he had grown to the women, the call of home never faded. He often dreamed of his mother's voice, the smell of her cooking, and his father's laughter, echoing through the village. Each dream cut deeper than the last. He realized that while he had escaped the cruelty of war, he could never escape the pull of his roots. One night, under the silver glow of the moon, Hoang knew what he had to do. His heart ached as he looked toward the horizon, toward the land he once defended, and the family he still longed for. That night, while the mountains slept, Hoang quietly took his first steps back home, unsure if he was leaving behind captivity or love. So, what was it like for Hoang Gan Dong going back home after 13 years? Let's find out. Hoang Gan Dong's road home. When the day finally came that Hoang Gan Dong heard the war was over, the words hit him like a thunderclap. For years, the world beyond the mountains had been a mystery, a dream half remembered. But now, peace has returned. His heart surged with emotions he could no longer contain. The stillness that had once comforted him now felt suffocating. After long nights of hesitation, he made the hardest decision of his life. He would leave. At dawn, he quietly packed his few belongings. Every glance at the familiar mountain paths felt like a farewell. Le Chi Ping and Nguyen Thi An stood before him, the two women who had once been his captors, now his closest companions. No words could capture what passed between them. Their eyes said everything: sorrow, gratitude, and an unspoken understanding that their time together had been something beyond war, beyond nationality. As he turned to leave, his heart felt as though it had been torn in two. Yet he knew this was not just a journey home, but a return to himself. The road back was long and winding. Each step was heavy, yet filled with hope. When he finally reached his hometown, the familiar scent of the soil greeted him like an embrace from the past. The same green hills stood proudly in the distance, but everything else had changed. The once bustling streets were quieter. Faces were older, wiser, marked by the same pain that war had carved into his soul. When Huang saw his parents waiting for him at the gate, their faces worn but their eyes alive with disbelief, his strength crumbled. Tears welled up as he rushed forward, clutching their trembling hands. Years of separation melted away in that moment, joy and grief intertwined in an indescribable mix of emotions. The homecoming was everything he had dreamed of, yet beneath it all, something felt incomplete. Life slowly returned to routine. Villagers came to greet him, to share stories and celebrate his survival. But no matter how warm their smiles were, Huang felt a growing emptiness. The laughter of the people couldn't fill the silence that echoed inside him. At night, when the village slept, he would stare at the moon and see the faces of Le Shiping and Nguyen Thi An flicker in his mind like ghosts of another world. He tried to speak of it, to his parents, to old friends, but they could not understand. To them, the mountains were the land of the enemy. To Huang, they were the land where he had found his humanity. The more he tried to adapt, the more he realized that the peace he had once longed for now felt like another kind of captivity. One day, through a chance encounter with a traveling merchant, he heard news about the Vietnamese borderlands, whispers that some former guerrilla women still lived in the hills. His heart leapt. Could they still be there? Were they safe? The questions haunted him until he could no longer ignore them. After many sleepless nights, Huang made his decision. He sat down with his parents and confessed his desire to return to the mountains, not to escape home, but to face what his heart could not forget. Though worry clouded their faces, they saw the fire in his eyes and gave their silent blessing. With a simple bag slung over his shoulder, he set out once again. The road felt both familiar and foreign, each step echoing with memories of laughter, survival, and love. When he reached the old mountain clearing, he found only silence. The campfire was long gone. The forest had reclaimed what was once theirs. Sitting alone on a moss-covered rock, he closed his eyes and could almost hear their voices again. The soft laughter, the crackling fire, the quiet moments that had defined his captivity and his freedom. In that stillness, Huang finally understood. Home was not just a place marked on a map. It was the collection of hearts and memories that shaped who he had become. The mountains, his village, his parents, Le Shiping, Nguyen Thi An, they were all part of his story. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer the naive soldier who once marched into war. He was a man who had seen the full range of human compassion and cruelty and had learned what it meant to cherish life, not as a soldier, not as a captive, but as a human being. But before Huang Ganzong adapted to life with the guerrilla women, how did he overcome his first few periods of being captured? Keep watching to find out. The Jungle Prison. From the very first day of his capture, Huang Ganzong's existence became a test of both body and spirit. The jungle that surrounded him was not just a landscape. It was a living, breathing prison. Towering trees reached endlessly toward the sky, their branches forming a canopy so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The air was heavy and wet, filled with the constant drone of insects, the distant shrieks of unseen creatures, and the slow, suffocating rhythm of tropical heat. Every breath he took felt thick with decay and humidity. Moving through that wilderness was torture. The undergrowth was dense and unrelenting. Tangled vines, thorny bushes, and hidden roots waiting to trip him with every step. Sweat poured down his back, his uniform soaked and clinging to his skin like a second, suffocating layer. Even standing still brought no relief. The air itself seemed to close in on him, pressing down like an invisible weight. In those early days, Huang's only thought was escape. The soldier in him refused to surrender. Every glance toward the endless green seemed to whisper the promise of freedom, if only he could reach it. But the jungle, vast and unforgiving, cared little for his desperation. He knew nothing of its terrain, its dangers, or its rules. One morning, when the women were momentarily distracted, Huang seized what he thought was his chance. Pretending to answer nature's call, he slipped into the thick foliage, moving as silently as his trembling legs would allow. The deeper he went, the more disoriented he became. The landscape repeated itself endlessly. Identical trees, endless vines, shadows that hid both salvation and death. Then, fate struck with merciless precision. As he stepped into a patch of dense brush, a flash of motion caught his eye too late. A pit viper, coiled and ready. The strike came fast and silent, its fangs sinking deep into his calf. Pain exploded through his leg, white-hot and blinding. He staggered, gasping, clutching at the wound as dizziness overtook him. The venom spread quickly, setting his body on fire from the inside. The jungle began to spin, his heartbeat thundered in his ears, and moments later, the world went black. When he awoke, it was night, and he was no longer alone. His captors had found him. But instead of the punishment he expected, he saw something he could not understand: mercy. The two women worked tirelessly over him, using herbs and oils they gathered from the forest. They drew out the venom with methods passed down through generations, crushing leaves into poultices and binding his wound with strips of cloth torn from their own garments. One of them, Ping, as he would later learn, became his caretaker. Her touch was steady but gentle, her face marked by exhaustion and quiet determination. She stayed close, watching his fevers, wiping the sweat from his brow, urging him to eat even when he could barely lift his head. In that harsh wilderness surrounded by death, she showed him something profoundly human: kindness. As Huang lay weak and delirious, the fever brought strange dreams. Memories of his military life blurred with visions of his current state. He dreamed of his mother's voice calling him home, of marching orders shouted through static, of comrades who might already be gone. Every sound of the jungle, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of cicadas, became a reminder that he was utterly alone, suspended between life and death. Days turned into weeks. The pain slowly faded, but the scars ran deeper than flesh. The soldier's defiance that had burned so brightly began to dim. He realized that survival now depended not on resistance, but on surrender, to the jungle, to his captors, to fate itself. The world beyond the trees no longer felt real. The thick canopy above was both his ceiling and his cage. In the long, humid nights, when he lay awake listening to the distant roar of the forest, he felt the weight of hopelessness settle into his bones. The war outside might one day end, but for Huang Ganzong, a different kind of war had begun, one that would last 13 long years, testing not only his endurance, but the very core of his humanity. He didn't know it then, but this jungle prison was not just a place of suffering. It was the crucible that would reshape him forever. So, who were guerrilla women? Stay tuned to find out. Women of War. Though much has been written about the battles and politics of the Vietnam War, there remains a haunting silence around the women who fought in it. Their stories exist mostly in fragments, faint traces in official records, half-forgotten testimonies whispered decades later. Yet these women were the backbone of one of the most resilient fighting forces in modern history. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnam undertook sweeping social reforms that forever changed the lives of its people. Determined to rally the population and prove that socialism meant equality for all, the government outlawed wife-beating, forced marriages, and child marriages, practices long rooted in rural life. But beyond laws and declarations, a deeper transformation was underway. Women were no longer confined to kitchens and farms. They were called to rebuild, to work, and ultimately, to fight. In the factories and rice paddies of the North, young women traded traditional roles for new identities as laborers, drivers, and soldiers. The war against the Americans, and later the Chinese, demanded hands, hearts, and courage from every corner of the nation. Women became an essential force in the Viet Cong, not as passive supporters, but as active participants in the machinery of war. They built bridges, carried ammunition through monsoon rains, and guided troops through deadly jungles. They also fought. Many were trained to lay booby traps, ambush patrols, and harass enemy convoys under cover of night. Some drove supply trucks through bombed-out roads, while others worked as smugglers and spies, weaving through the chaos with intelligence reports hidden in baskets of rice. Their courage was as quiet as it was fierce, rooted not in hatred, but in a burning sense of duty. Historians estimate that over 1.5 million women served in the North Vietnamese military during the war, nearly 70% of all youth volunteers. For many, it was a calling born of both ideology and vengeance. They were inspired by communist ideals of equality, the revolutionary spirit of their leaders, and the proud legacy of female warriors that stretched back centuries, from the legendary Trung sisters who rose against Chinese rule to the countless unnamed heroines who defended their villages from foreign invaders. Others joined for deeply personal reasons, to avenge loved ones lost to bombings, to protect their homes, or simply because they refused to stand aside while others fought for freedom. Yet, for all the rhetoric of equality, the war did not erase the old hierarchies. Discrimination lingered, even in the ranks of the revolution. Women were often limited to support roles, assigned to cook, clean, or carry supplies, while their male counterparts fought at the front. When propaganda celebrated their bravery, it often did so by painting them as symbols of purity and motherhood, flowers on the front lines, delicate and dutiful, rather than fierce and free. Still, some women shattered those expectations. They took up rifles, led ambushes, and commanded units deep within the jungle. They proved, time and again, that survival and courage knew no gender. Among them were those who would later face the Chinese invasion, hardened veterans who had spent their youth in the fires of one war only to find themselves thrown into another. In South Vietnam, the story unfolded differently. Women were primarily trained as nurses, clerks, and administrators, serving through the Women's Armed Forces Corps, which by 1967 counted more than 2,700 members. These women rarely saw combat, their service confined to offices and hospitals. Yet even in the South, the tides of war began to draw women closer to the front lines. After the Tet Offensive of 1968, the South Vietnamese government debated a controversial proposal, a draft for all women aged 18 to 25. Though the bill ultimately failed, it revealed the desperation of a nation stretched to its limits. Soon after, the People's Self-Defense Force was created, a local militia that enlisted over 1 million women by 1970. At least 100,000 of them were trained for combat, and some even attended airborne school, learning to jump from planes into danger. Through decades of war, these women became both the builders and defenders of their nation. They carried the burdens of family and revolution, endured loss beyond measure, and still stood unbroken. Their presence in battlefields blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, between nurturer and warrior. Among these countless faces were Lê Shi Ping and Nguyen Thi An, two women whose paths would one day cross that of a lost Chinese soldier named Hoang Ganzong. To the world, they were nameless guerrillas. To him, they would become something far more complicated, captors, saviors, and companions in a place where war met the boundaries of the human heart. But what was the truth about the forgotten war? The same war where Hoang Ganzong was captured. Keep watching to find out. The Forgotten War. The Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 is often buried beneath the towering headlines of the Cold War. Yet for those who lived through it, it was a storm of unimaginable ferocity. Though it lasted barely a month, from February 17th to March 16th, its scars ran deep, cutting through nations, families, and souls. The conflict may have been brief on paper, but in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, it was long enough to destroy tens of thousands of lives. China's leaders called it a punitive expedition. Officially, it was meant to punish Vietnam for invading Cambodia and toppling the Khmer Rouge, a regime Beijing had supported. But beneath the official slogans and fiery rhetoric lay something more complex, a battle for pride, power, and dominance in a region already split by superpower rivalries. As Vietnam drew closer to the Soviet Union, China saw its influence slipping. To reassert itself, it chose to fight a war that would prove far more costly than anticipated. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, that marched southward into Vietnam was not the same hardened revolutionary army that had once fought in the civil wars of the past. By 1979, it was an army in transition, trying to modernize, but still clinging to outdated tactics. Many of the men sent to the front were little more than boys, barely 18 years old, their faces still soft with youth. Recruited in haste, trained in weeks, they were thrown into a jungle that would consume them whole. These young conscripts carried more fear than experience. Some were assigned to the rear lines, away from the glory of the front, tasked with hauling supplies, repairing trucks, and tending to the wounded under skies thick with gunfire. They trudged through mud and blood along narrow mountain trails, their uniforms soaked with sweat and rain, their nerves frayed by the constant echo of unseen gunshots. Many were barely armed. Some carried no weapon at all. For them, the enemy came not as uniformed battalions, but as shadows. The Vietnamese army, honed by decades of brutal warfare against France and the United States, was a force unlike any other. Their strength was not in numbers or firepower, but in patience, precision, and deep understanding of the land they defended. The dense jungles, steep ridges, and twisting rivers were not obstacles, they were allies. Among the most formidable defenders were the Vietnamese guerrilla women. They were not symbols or auxiliaries, they were warriors. Many had already fought through the long years of the Vietnam War, their courage forged in fire and loss. They knew every sound of the forest, every whisper of wind that preceded an ambush. Their traps were deadly, their movements silent, their resolve unbreakable. Operating in small, mobile cells, these women struck where the enemy least expected. They ambushed supply convoys, sabotaged communication lines, and attacked medical outposts far behind enemy territory. Hidden beneath foliage and mist, they watched as unsuspecting Chinese soldiers passed by, and then unleashed chaos with surgical precision. For the PLA, the experience was a nightmare. Communication lines broke down, units became isolated, and confusion spread like wildfire. Ambushes erupted out of nowhere. Trucks loaded with supplies were set ablaze, and screams echoed through the jungle as gunfire vanished into the trees. The Chinese soldiers were trained to fight open battles, but here there were no front lines, no rules, and no mercy. The deeper they pushed into Vietnamese territory, the more they found themselves swallowed by an invisible enemy. The guerrillas attacked at night, disappearing by dawn, leaving only smoke and silence in their wake. While most of these women fought to defend their homeland, a few went further, turning their captives into prisoners of both circumstance and compassion. For soldiers like Huang Ganzong, who would fall into their hands, the battlefield did not end with surrender. His war would continue deep within the jungle, in ways no military training could have prepared him for. The world may remember 1979 as a brief border conflict, but for those who lived through it, the frightened conscripts, the hardened guerrillas, the mothers who waited for sons who never returned, it was a human tragedy that lingered long after the guns fell silent. So, how were the guerrilla women remembered for their services in the war? Stay tuned to find out. The forgotten warriors of war. When the war finally ended, the guns fell silent. But for many Vietnamese women who had fought, the silence was not peace, it was rejection. They returned home carrying memories of battle, and the hope of rebuilding their lives, only to discover they had no place in the society they had fought to protect. During the war, women had been forbidden from forming relationships or marrying. They were told that love and duty could not coexist, that the revolution came first. But after the war, those same women were suddenly judged by the old traditions they had left behind. Vietnam expected them to return to their proper roles as wives and mothers. Yet the scars they bore, both visible and unseen, made them outsiders. Many were viewed as damaged or unfit for marriage. Villagers whispered that battle had made them too hard, too independent, or too broken to build families. Others believed their injuries or exposure to chemicals made them too weak to bear children. The irony was cruel. Women who had been hailed as heroes were now seen as burdens. They were left to live in quiet isolation, their bravery erased from official records, and their sacrifices ignored in the government's retelling of history. Even accessing veteran benefits proved nearly impossible. Official recognition was scarce, and many of these women spent their lives struggling with poverty, illness, and the emotional toll of being forgotten. For them, the war never truly ended. It simply changed shape. Across the ocean, a different kind of story unfolded. Between 1964 and 1975, more than 8,000 Vietnamese women came to the United States as war brides. They had married American soldiers during or after the conflict, hoping for a new start in a land of peace and promise. But many found themselves lost in unfamiliar worlds, their identities torn between two nations still haunted by war. Thousands of Amerasian children, born to American fathers and Vietnamese mothers, were left behind when the U.S. withdrew. When the soldiers went home, many never returned for their families. These children, easily recognized by their mixed features, grew up facing relentless discrimination, poverty, and alienation. Decades later, around 26,000 of them, along with several thousand relatives, were finally allowed to immigrate to America in the 1980s and 1990s. But the pain of abandonment lingered, a wound that no policy could heal. And for the women who fled Vietnam during the Indochina refugee crisis, survival brought its own horrors. Many escaped on overcrowded boats, only to fall prey to pirates off the coasts of Thailand and Malaysia. They were beaten, defiled, and kidnapped, their bodies turned into battlefields long after the war had officially ended. These stories rarely made headlines, but they tell of courage born from desperation, of women who refused to stop fighting for life even when the world had turned its back on them. Meanwhile, the land itself remained scarred. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were littered with unexploded bombs and landmines, deadly remnants of one of the most intense bombing campaigns in history. Long after the soldiers left, women became the quiet heroes of peace, working in demining teams, risking their lives to clear the ground where children now play and farmers grow food. The war's most haunting legacy, however, came not from bullets or bombs, but from chemicals. The U.S. military's widespread use of Agent Orange left entire regions poisoned. Forests died, rivers turned toxic, and generations were born with illnesses and deformities. French-Vietnamese journalist and former Viet Cong soldier Tran To Nga became one of the few to fight back, launching campaigns against the chemical manufacturers, demanding justice for the millions who still live with the consequences. Through all of this, the discrimination, the silence, the suffering Vietnam's women endured, they fought wars on battlefields, and later, wars within their own homes, their communities, and even their bodies. Their resilience became invisible, buried beneath propaganda and time. But for those who knew them, and for men like Hoang Ganzong, who once lived among them, their strength was unforgettable. Because behind every story of captivity, love, or vengeance in that brutal jungle, there stood women who had already survived far worse than war itself. So, what was Hoang Ganzong's legacy of survival? Keep watching to find out. Hoang Ganzong's silent legacy. When Hoang Ganzong finally returned home, The war was long over, but the war inside him had just begun. His re-entry into civilian life was marked by relief, grief, and the heavy silence of memories he couldn't escape. Though hailed as a survivor and offered military honors, Hoang wanted none of it. The government tried to make him a symbol of endurance, granting him pensions, therapy, and invitations to speak as a national hero, but he turned them all down. For years, his case remained classified, buried deep within military archives, too sensitive, too confusing, and too human to fit into neat wartime narratives. His story unsettled officials, blurring the line between victim and survivor, love and coercion, patriotism and guilt. In the end, Hoang lived and died in quiet solitude, a man haunted by both what was done to him and what he felt in return. His ordeal stood as a reminder that not all prisoners return as heroes, and not all captors are monsters. The truth, as he often said, is somewhere in the jungle, between the trees, the fear, and the silence. What would you do if you ever found yourself in Hoang Ganzong's position? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video shown on your screen to catch up on your favorite celebrity stories. See you there.